Hey everyone, I hope you've all been enjoying Sci-Fest so far. I know I have. I can imagine how fun it must be to go from one showcase to another, learning about cool new discoveries in science and new experiments. And in the midst of all this excitement, I wanted to take the time to introduce myself. My name is Harrison. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California, but right now I'm a student at Harvard University. And even though I'm a student, I'm still taking classes like all of you are. I'm also a scientist. Yeah, I'm pretty much Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson now. No, but in all seriousness, I'm a scientist. And all of you can be a scientist as well. I know a lot of you might think that just adults can be scientists, or maybe you think that science is just learning and memorizing a lot of facts. But that's not true at all. The way I see it, science isn't memorizing facts, it's a way of thinking. And I guarantee that all of you think like a scientist already. Let me show you. Let's say you wake up early in the morning, 7 a.m., early in the morning, and look out the window. You notice that the sky is kind of cloudy, and there's a lot of people outside wearing jackets and holding umbrellas. What do you think that means? If you look outside and see that, what does your mind automatically think of? A lot of you might answer, very reasonably, that if it's cloudy outside and a lot of people are wearing jackets and holding umbrellas, then it must be raining. And that's a very reasonable guess. No one told you it was raining. You didn't look at the weather forecast. Your parents didn't tell you that it's raining. But just by making observations about your surroundings, you made a guess that it was raining. And this is very logical. But now let's add a twist to it. Let's say that you're not entirely sure that it's raining. I mean, after all, you don't want to have to carry your umbrella outside if it's not raining. That's just a waste of energy. So now that you've guessed that it's raining, how would you put that guess to the test? How would you actually make sure that it is raining? What would you do? Well, one way is literally walk outside and see if it is raining. That might help. Or maybe you can put a cup outside, and after 1 hour or so, if there's water in the cup, it's probably raining. There's a lot of ways to test if your guess was correct. And the final step is to think about the results that you had. Let's say that when you went outside, you immediately got wet. I mean, chances are you can reasonably conclude that it was raining. Or maybe the water cup that you put out was indeed full of water after half an hour. Then you can conclude that your guess was correct. It is raining. But it's possible that your guess wasn't correct. And if that's the case, that you find out that your guess was probably wrong, that's totally fine. You just adjust your guess for the next time. You can simply conclude that your guess was wrong. And the whole process that I described, which is something that you might go through every day, not in the case of rain in particular, but just this general thought process of making guesses and seeing if your guess was correct, this is science. And I know that might be hard to believe, but let me go through the whole process again, but this time using scientific language. When you woke up and looked outside, you were making observations, and scientists make observations all the time. For example, Isaac Newton made the observation that apples fall down. And based on that observation, he made a guess that there is some kind of force pulling things downward, which he called gravity. So you made your observation, and based on those observations, you made a logical guess that it might be raining. And in scientific terms, this guess is a hypothesis. Now, once you made your hypothesis, you didn't just leave it at that. You wanted to make sure that it was raining. You wanted to test if your hypothesis was correct. And the way you did that was you designed an experiment. Your experiment might have been super simple. Go outside, see if rain's falling on you. Or it might have been a little more complicated. You could have had a cup outside collecting water, and if the cup was full of water, you can reasonably conclude that it is indeed raining. The water collecting in your cup can be part of the data that you collect in your experiment. And finally, based on your experiment and the findings and data you have from your experiments, you can come to a conclusion. And in this case, the conclusion is that it's either raining or it's not raining. And this whole process that you went through, which is actually something that you might go through every day, whether that be choosing your clothes or deciding what to eat, or even figuring out who you want to be friends with at school, this guess and check method is what scientists call the scientific method. A lot of these words, hypothesis, theory, scientific method, they might sound complicated and scary, but really it's something that you do every day, and it's something that scientists do every day as well. Now, let me talk about how I use the scientific method in my research as a scientist. I am a scientist who studies cancer, and for those of you who don't know what cancer is, let me try to explain it. Your body is made out of small building blocks called cells, and when you grow up, these cells divide. And this division of cells over and over is actually what helps your body get bigger and taller and stronger as you get older. However, the problem is that in some people, especially in adults, these cells start dividing too much. And this can cause a lot of problems for your heart, your brain, and for a lot of other parts in your body. And that's what cancer is. It's when the cells divide too much in your body. So there are a lot of medicines and medications that are used to fight against cancer. For example, you can actually use radiation and radioactive materials to kill these cancer cells. That's been shown to be rather effective. There's also something that's called chemotherapy, which is a chemical that you inject in your body, and that kills cancer cells as well. However, what's interesting is that this chemotherapy, it doesn't work on all cancer cells, and scientists don't actually know why. We're not exactly sure what it is about the chemotherapy or what it is about the cancer cells that makes the chemotherapy not effective in killing these cells. And that's my job as a scientist. My colleagues and I in the lab that I work in are trying to figure out why chemotherapy doesn't work in some cells. And we have a lot of guesses. For example, some cancer cells might have specific proteins that fight against the chemotherapy, making the chemotherapy not that effective. Or maybe it has something to do with the DNA and the RNA inside of these cancers. We're not really sure, but we have a lot of guesses. We have a lot of hypotheses. So our job is to design a lot of experiments to figure out if these hypotheses are true or if they're not true. So for example, this past summer, I've been doing a lot of research on these things called extracellular vesicles, and they carry RNA and proteins, which are these small molecules. And we are guessing that these small molecules are what's helping the cancer cells stay alive even when treated against chemotherapy. And so far, our findings have shown that these small molecules actually do seem to be helping these cancer cells survive. So far, our data does support our hypothesis. So as you can see, you can easily apply the thought process that you do in your everyday life to science. And that's super exciting because that means that you're closer to being a scientist than you probably thought. Most of you already have the right mindset to be a scientist. And as you might imagine, coming up with these guesses requires a lot of creativity. And coming up with experiments to figure out whether these hypotheses are true or not also requires creativity and strong analysis. So science is definitely not just memorizing facts. You have to have a creative mind. You have to think outside the box. So as long as you all keep having that scientific mindset, creative thinking, and have something that you're passionate about, you're more than equipped to become a great scientist. And I'm so excited for you all to do that. Now, let me set the record straight. I'm not saying that you don't have to pay attention in science class when your teacher is teaching you facts or making you memorize things. Those things are important to help you come up with hypotheses and come up with experiments. But what I'm saying is that science is more than just memorizing facts. Thank you all so much for watching. I know this talk might have been a little bit different than what you've been seeing in SciFest with all the cool experiments and the great discoveries, but I just want to sit down and talk to you from a student's perspective, because I know you're all students and I'm a student myself. And I know that it can definitely be a struggle when you're in class trying to learn a lot of new things, and a lot of it you might not understand. But what I want to say is that science is fun and something that you should look forward to. It's making discoveries and being creative the entire way through. And speaking of creativity, I wanted to show you all a short animation that I made just last year. The animation's about DNA. And don't worry if you don't know what DNA is or if you don't understand all the complicated words in the video. I just hope that you gain a better understanding and appreciation for what science is. Just to let you know, if you do enjoy this animation, I make a lot more of these on my YouTube channel called Powerhouse of the Cell. So if you want to learn more cool science, make sure to check out my YouTube channel at Powerhouse of the Cell. I hope you all enjoy.
This is DNA. But how do we know what it looks like? Well, in 1909, it was discovered that DNA was made up of these small building blocks called nucleotides. These nucleotides are made of 3 parts: a sugar with 5 carbons, a negatively charged phosphate group, and something that has a lot of nitrogens, appropriately named nitrogenous bases. Notice how the sugars and phosphate groups are identical in the 4 different nucleotides, but the nitrogenous bases are unique. The names of the nitrogenous bases are adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. So okay, these are the building blocks of DNA, but how do we actually put these building blocks together? At the start, many scientists thought that they combined like this, with 4 nucleotides making up one DNA. They called this the tetranucleotide hypothesis, with tetra meaning 4, kind of like Tetris. However, this wasn't correct. It wasn't until 1953 when Watson and Crick, using the incredibly important data from Rosalind Franklin, figured out how the building blocks were put together. Take a look. Their model was beautiful, and it turned out to be absolutely correct. Now I want you to pay attention to a couple of DNA's features. First, notice how the spaces between the helix aren't all the same size. This groove is larger than this one, so they're respectively called the major groove and minor groove. Because the major groove is larger, it's more susceptible for things to attach or bind to it, which is something we'll come back to in the next few videos. Now, let's unwind the helix and look more closely. Remember that DNA actually isn't flat, but looking at it this way will help us analyze DNA better. Notice how DNA is made of 2 strands. Each strand consists of many nucleotides and is therefore called a polynucleotide strand. The nucleotides combine together by forming covalent bonds between the phosphate group of one nucleotide and the sugar of the next nucleotide, so these bonds are appropriately called phosphodiester bonds. And notice that the 2 strands interact with each other as well. The nitrogenous bases in each strand face each other and form hydrogen bonds across. Note that A always pairs with T, and C always pairs with G. Something else to keep in mind is that hydrogen bonds are much weaker than covalent bonds, so while it wouldn't be difficult to separate the 2 strands, it'd be much harder to break the strands themselves. Thus, these 2 strands are often called the backbone of DNA. And since they consist of the sugar and phosphate components of nucleotides, they're more specifically called the sugar-phosphate backbone. And one more thing, the 2 strands appear to be parallel, but if you look at the individual nucleotides, you'll notice that they face opposite directions in each strand. You could say that the 2 strands are anti-parallel, and as you'll see in the next few videos, this bidirectionality is really important. So scientists needed a way to label which direction is which. They could have gone with west and east or left and right, but instead, scientists went with something more specific. Remember how I said that the sugar in each molecule has 5 carbons? Well, scientists realized that they could give each of these carbons a number, with the number 1 carbon, or 1' carbon, being attached to the nitrogenous base, and the number 5 carbon, or 5' carbon, being attached to the phosphate. And looking at these numbers, we can see a difference between the 2 strands. In this strand, the 5' carbon is on the left side, and the 3' carbon is on the other side. And on the other strand, the opposite is true. Thus, each direction of DNA is labeled either 5' or 3'.